A white manager refused to cash a check for a black client, humiliating her and insinuating suspicion about the source of her funds. What he didn't realize was that she owned the bank. What happened next will shock even the most seasoned observers. But first, let's start from the beginning. The day began like any other for Mr. Richard Calloway, the manager of a prestigious downtown bank. The branch's gleaming white columns shone in the morning sunlight, and he was ready for another typical day of dealing with wealthy clients and routines that reaffirmed his place in the financial world. That's when she walked in. Her tall stature and confident posture immediately drew the attention of several clients and staff members. Dressed in a sharp business suit and carrying a leather briefcase of undeniable quality, she approached the counter. "Good morning. I'd like to deposit this check into my account," she said calmly, handing the check to the young cashier. The cashier glanced at the amount and visibly tensed. It was a hefty 6-figure check. Quickly regaining her composure, she directed the woman to the manager's office. "Ma'am, this is quite a large sum. We'll need you to speak with our manager," the cashier whispered. The woman nodded, her expression unchanging, and headed toward the office. "Mr. Calloway, there's a customer here with a large check," the cashier informed him. Richard looked up from his documents, his expression darkening as soon as he saw the visitor. His years of banking experience told him that this client was not typical for his branch, but he masked his thoughts with a professional facade. "How can I help you?" he asked curtly, barely glancing at the woman. "I'm here to deposit this check into my account," she repeated calmly, placing the check on his desk. Richard slowly picked up the paper, scrutinizing it with barely concealed suspicion. "This is quite a large sum," he muttered. "I'll need to verify the source of these funds. It's standard procedure." "All the necessary documents and contacts are listed on the check," the woman replied, her tone steady. "You can contact my legal firm to confirm the transaction." "Even so, I'll need to delay this transaction for further verification," Richard replied reluctantly. "Perhaps you could provide additional evidence of your business's legitimacy?" Tathagini, woman furrowed her brows slightly but kept her voice calm. "My business is fully compliant with the law. You have everything you need. I expect this transaction to be processed without delay." "I decide how and when things get processed here," Richard retorted, raising his voice slightly. His tone drew the attention of staff members, who subtly peeked from behind their desks. At this point, the young cashier, Eliza, intervened. "Mr. Calloway, I've seen this client conduct large transactions with our bank before. Her name is familiar to me." "Eliza, you're dismissed," Richard said coldly. Turning back to the client, he added, "If you'd like, you can file a complaint, but I have the right to investigate any check I deem suspicious." The woman sighed, maintaining her composure. "Very well then. I'll need to contact the bank's leadership. I believe they'll be interested in how you're conducting these investigations." Richard Calloway continued to scrutinize the check, even though all the required documentation was already in front of him. The atmosphere in the office grew increasingly tense. "Listen, Miss..." He deliberately refrained from using her name, though her documents were right in front of him. "I'm just doing my job. Verifications are mandatory for sums like these." "I appreciate your concern for protocol, Mr. Calloway, but I doubt this delay aligns with the bank's internal standards," she replied icily, folding her hands over her briefcase. "You have all the required documents. If there's an issue..." "What is it?" Richard hesitated, his tone growing sharper. "The issue is that amounts like this are not typical for clients like you. Understand?" Her eyes narrowed briefly, but she gave no outward reaction. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "Fine. If you can't complete this transaction, I'll call someone who can." Sensing the situation spiraling out of control, Eliza made one last attempt to intervene. She quietly approached Richard and whispered, "Mr. Calloway, I'm sorry, but I'm confident her account is in good standing. This client is one of the bank's major depositors. She's conducted similar transactions before. Richard cut her off sharply, waving her away. Eliza, you have enough of your own work to do. Get back to it. Blushing, Eliza cast a quick, apologetic glance at the client before retreating. Meanwhile, the woman was already on the phone, her tone calm but firm. Yes, please connect me to the leadership team. It's urgent. I'm having an issue processing. A check at one of your branches. Thank you. Richard grew wary but tried to maintain his composure. Whoever you're calling, he began, trying to regain control. They'll tell you the same thing. Procedures require verification. I can't change that. At that moment, the office door swung open and a sharply dressed middle-aged woman entered. It was Jean Ellis, the bank's regional director. Her expression was a mix of irritation and professional severity. What's going on here? She demanded, her gaze sweeping the room. Richard stood up, visibly surprised. Jean, I wasn't expecting you. We're just performing a routine check on a large transaction. A check? Jean turned to the client, her expression softening instantly. Miss Brooks, my apologies. I didn't know you were here. Is something wrong? The client glanced at Richard, then back at Jean. Her voice remained steady, but her words were deliberate. It seems Mr. Calloway believes my check requires special scrutiny. Apparently his concerns are not about the amount, but something else. Jean squinted, clearly catching the implication. Richard, you do understand who our clients are, don't you? Her tone turned icy. Of course, he muttered, visibly nervous. I just wanted to ensure everything was in order. That's enough, Jean interrupted. Miss Brooks, your transaction will be processed immediately. Please wait in the lounge. I'll personally oversee it. As the client left the office, her gaze lingered on Richard for a moment. The look in her eyes made it clear. This wasn't over. Jean, I was just... Richard began, but she silenced him with a raised hand. You just made a serious mistake, she said sharply, and there will be consequences. Richard paled, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control. Jean Ellis led Cynthia Brooks into the conference room, carefully offering her a glass of water and assuring her the matter would be resolved promptly. Meanwhile, Richard Calloway, left alone in his office, felt cold sweat trickling down his back. He realized the enormity of his mistake, but it was too late to backtrack. His position in the bank was now in jeopardy, and he frantically tried to come up with an excuse. A few minutes later, Jean returned to his office, her expression stern, her voice sharp. Richard, do you realize who you were just speaking to? She began without preamble. A client with a suspicious check, he replied flatly, trying to maintain his composure. Am I not supposed to verify large sums? Jean smirked, though her eyes were icy. Suspicious? That suspicious check came from her own corporate account. Now let me ask you, why did you think verification was necessary? Is this standard practice for all clients, or did you apply a special approach? Richard began mumbling something about safety and protocols, but Jean raised her hand, silencing him. Enough. You didn't even bother to look at her portfolio. She threw a folder onto his desk. Let me remind you who Cynthia Brooks is. She's the largest shareholder in our bank. She owns a controlling stake and, for that matter, could fire you with a single phone call. Richard froze, his face turning pale, like someone who had just heard their sentence pronounced. This must be a mistake, he whispered. I couldn't have known. You should have, Jean countered coldly. And do you know what's worse? It wasn't just a mistake. You let your biases interfere with your job. That's unacceptable. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Cynthia calmly reviewed her documents, though her sharp eyes betrayed her focus. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Eliza entered with a tray holding a glass of water and a folder. Miss Brooks, I apologize for disturbing you. Eliza said softly. I just wanted to say thank you for your patience. Cynthia smiled. Thank you, Eliza. I noticed you tried to help. That says a lot about you. When Eliza left, Cynthia pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Within moments, her voice carried an air of confidence and decisiveness. Janet, this is Cynthia. I have a request. Gather the leadership team and schedule a meeting. We need to discuss the management of one of our branches. Yes, it's urgent. Meanwhile, John returned to the conference room, her face still tense. Miss Brooks, everything is ready. Your check has been processed. Please accept my sincerest apologies for what happened. Cynthia stood up, collected her documents, and said, her voice steady and measured, You're not at fault, John, but I can't allow such things to continue in my bank. We're going to have a serious conversation. As she left the branch, clients and staff silently watched her departure. Richard, standing by his office window, could only watch as his career crumbled before his eyes. The next day, Cynthia Brooks sat in the spacious conference room of the bank's headquarters. Across the table from her sat key figures of the management team, including John Ellis, who looked noticeably tense, and Richard Calloway, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. Cynthia began speaking calmly, though her voice was firm. Yesterday's incident at your branch wasn't just a mistake. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. As the largest shareholder in this bank, I consider it my responsibility to address this. She turned her gaze to Jean. You're a professional, but it's your duty to ensure that all branches adhere to principles of respect and equality. What happened yesterday is unacceptable. Jean nodded in agreement, but Calloway couldn't stay silent. Miss Brooks, allow me to explain. It was standard procedure. I didn't intend... Cynthia raised her hand, cutting him off. Richard, don't try to justify yourself. Your standard procedures were selective. You ignored my documents, relied on prejudice, and neglected your, duties. This isn't about protocol. It's about your attitude. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he met her cold stare. Cynthia continued, addressing the rest of the team. This bank thrives on the trust of its clients. If we allow incidents like this to persist, we'll lose that trust. This is not just about Richard. It's about the entire system. That's why I'm proposing concrete changes. She laid out documents before them. First, mandatory staff training on principles of inclusion and cultural competence. Second, a review of all internal procedures to eliminate bias. Third, the establishment of an internal mechanism for complaints from both clients and employees. These measures will be implemented within a month. The management murmured among themselves, discussing her proposal. Jean was the first to voice her support. This is necessary. We cannot let incidents like this tarnish our reputation. Cynthia turned to Richard. You understand you can't stay in your position after yesterday, don't you? Richard turned pale but said nothing. He knew resistance was futile. You'll be given a choice, Cynthia continued. Resign with a letter of recommendation, or face an internal investigation. I suggest you think carefully. By the end of the meeting, Cynthia left the room feeling a sense of accomplishment, but her work wasn't done yet. Later that same day, she returned to the branch where the conflict had unfolded. Eliza noticed her and cautiously approached. Miss Brooks, it's good to see you, Eliza said. Cynthia smiled. Eliza, I noticed your courage when you tried to intervene. That's a valuable quality. If you're interested in advancing your career, reach out to me. I think the bank has room for employees, like you. Eliza blushed at the unexpected compliment. Clients and staff watched as Cynthia left the building with her head held high. This was no longer just her bank. It was a symbol of how one person could change an entire system.